not losing your mind. But you've started to wonder, haven't you? You've started catching yourself mid-sentence, second-guessing things you know you saw, replaying conversations at 2 a.m., trying to work out where you went wrong, apologizing for things that clearly weren't your fault, and somehow still not being completely sure they weren't. And here's what makes it so disorienting. There's nothing to point to. They never screamed at you, never threw anything, never called you names in front of people. If you tried to explain it to someone on the outside, you wouldn't even know where to start. Because what would you say? That sometimes they go quiet in a very specific way that makes your stomach drop, that you consistently feel worse after talking to them than before, but you can't articulate why. There's a name for what's happening to you. And it's not just gaslighting. That word gets used so broadly now it's lost half its precision. What I'm describing is more specific than that, a more deliberate mechanism. One that psychologists have studied and named, and once I give you that name, a lot of things from your past are going to click into place in a way that might be uncomfortable. I'll get to it. But first, I need to walk you through exactly how this works, phase by phase, because the only way to stop it is to see its structure clearly, and most people never do. This is how covert narcissists make you feel crazy without ever raising their voice. Let me name this properly, because naming it changes everything. Researchers in the field of coercive control call it ambient abuse, not a single dramatic incident, not a pattern you can chart on a timeline and show to a friend. Just a constant, low-level atmosphere designed to erode your confidence in your own perception so gradually that you never notice it happening. Think of it like carbon monoxide poisoning. No smell, no color, nothing visible. You feel fine until you don't. And by the time you realize something is wrong, you're already disoriented, already doubting yourself, already looking to the one person causing the damage to tell you what's real. That's not an accident, that's the design. And here's why it works on intelligent, self-aware people. People who could describe this process in a clinical setting and still find themselves inside it. It exploits the exact thing that makes you a good person. It turns your empathy into its mechanism. We'll get there. But let's start at the beginning, because phase one is the hardest to see. It starts with something that genuinely feels like love. Covert narcissists are extraordinary at reading people. In the early stages of a relationship, romantic, friendship, even professional, they study you. They notice what makes you feel understood, what makes you lower your guard, what makes you feel safe in a way you rarely feel safe. And then they give you exactly that, generously, consistently, without you asking. This is called idealization. And here's what most people miss about it. It's not entirely manufactured. They are capable of real moments of warmth and connection, which is exactly what makes everything that follows so confusing. If the warmth were fake from the beginning, your nervous system would flag it. Something would feel off. But it doesn't, because it isn't. The warmth is real. The problem is that it's conditional, and the conditions aren't visible yet. Then very slowly the calibration begins. Not criticism, that would be too obvious, too easy to name and refuse. It comes dressed as concern, as honesty, as someone who cares enough to say the hard thing. I love you, but sometimes you're really hard to read. I'm not trying to make you feel bad, I just think you might be overreacting a little. Are you okay? You've just seemed off lately. I'm worried about you. Notice the architecture of those sentences. They're not attacks, they're observations, delivered quietly, in the tone of someone who cares deeply about your well-being. And because you trust them, and because you're a person who takes feedback seriously, you absorb those observations. You start self-monitoring. You start asking yourself, am I hard to read? Am I overreacting? Have I been off? You've just accepted their narrative about you as your own, and you did it willingly because it was wrapped in what looked exactly like love. That's phase one. It's quiet, it's soft, and it sets up everything that comes next. Phase two is where the mechanism becomes something more deliberate and considerably harder to name in the moment. Here's where reality revision begins. A covert narcissist starts rewriting events. Not with dramatic declarations that never happened, sounds too extreme, too obviously wrong. They do it with hesitation, with gentle confusion, with something that looks a lot like sadness. I remember it differently, slow, a furrowed brow, as if they're genuinely troubled by the gap between your accounts. I think you might be misremembering that. You were under a lot of stress that week. I said that because you asked me to. You don't remember asking me to? Each time this happens, you face a choice: trust your memory or trust them. And here's the trap: you care about them. Caring about someone means giving them the benefit of the doubt, and caring people can get things wrong. So maybe they're right. Maybe you were stressed. Maybe you did say that. And by the way, studies show that sustained self-doubt over time literally impairs memory recall. Not because something is wrong with your brain. Because when you spend months chronically second-guessing your own perception, your brain stops encoding memories as reliably. The confusion you feel isn't evidence of your instability. It's the direct result of a sustained, targeted strategy. I want to stop here for a second and ask you something directly. Because if this sounds like conversations you've actually had, if you're reading this and thinking of specific moments, stay with me. Because what comes next explains something important: why it was so hard to see while you were inside it. The escalation phase doesn't announce itself. There's no moment where things obviously tip. No incident you can point to as the turning point. The tactics just get applied more consistently. The scope expands quietly, and eventually the cycle becomes the relationship itself. You say something, they go quiet, not angry, wounded, and by now you've learned what that silence means. You retract what you said, soften it, add qualifiers. Apologize. Even when you can't quite locate what you're apologizing for, they come back. And when they do, they're warm. Sometimes very warm, the version of them you first fell for. And your nervous system floods with relief. Psychologists call this intermittent reinforcement. It's the same mechanism that makes gambling addictive. Unpredictable rewards are neurologically more compelling than consistent ones. The brain works harder to recreate a positive outcome it can't predict. When warmth is random and withdrawal is frequent, you don't pull away from the person. You bond more tightly. You invest more effort in bringing back the good version. You start to believe that if you can just figure out the right behavior, the right tone, the right timing, you can keep them there. Meanwhile, you've adapted in ways you haven't fully clocked. You've stopped sharing certain things with friends because explaining it is exhausting and you know how it sounds. You filter what you say before you say it. You've started apologizing preemptively before anything has gone wrong, just to keep the temperature stable. Covert narcissists, by the way, love to describe themselves as highly sensitive. And they genuinely are, remarkably consistently sensitive to any shift in their control. The moment you stop managing their feelings and start paying attention to your own, that's when the silence gets its coldest. That's not love. That's adaptation to a controlled environment. Now here's the question nobody seems to ask. Why does this work on smart, self-aware people? Because it does. Therapists, doctors, people who could describe this entire process in academic language still find themselves inside it, still second-guessing themselves, still apologizing for things they didn't do. And the reason isn't naivety. It isn't weakness. It isn't a failure of intelligence. The reason is that covert narcissists specifically target empathy. People with high empathy are wired, often from very early in life, to consider other people's experiences before their own. When someone says, "You hurt me," the empathic response is to pause, to check yourself, to take their experience seriously. A covert narcissist doesn't just know this, they depend on it. Every wounded silence, every withdrawn affection, every carefully constructed, "I'm not trying to make you feel bad, but..." It only works if you care enough to respond. If you didn't care, none of this would land. And here's what makes it a trap. The more you engage with their reality, the more you try to understand it, defend yourself within it, or fix it, the more you reinforce the premise that their version of events is the legitimate framework. You're on their court, playing by their rules, with a rule book they can revise at any moment. This next part is the one most people resist. But it matters. You're not trapped because something is wrong with you. You're trapped because you're capable of love. And they built a cage out of it. Most people assume the silence is restraint. That when someone walks out of the room instead of raising their voice, they're being the bigger person, exercising maturity, choosing not to escalate. Here's what's actually happening. The silence is the weapon. In most cases, it's a more effective one than screaming would ever be. A raised voice can be witnessed, described to a friend. "He screamed at me for an hour" has a shape. People understand it, they respond to it, they believe it. It's evidence. But silence, a covert narcissist silence, is completely deniable. "I just needed space to process. I wasn't giving you the silent treatment. I was upset and didn't want to say something I'd regret." I don't know why you always read my quietness as punishment. There's nothing to report. No incident, no evidence, just a feeling in your body, and by now you've been carefully taught not to trust that feeling. The absence of an outburst is not the absence of control. It's a different and more sophisticated version of it. Because silence doesn't just communicate displeasure, it manufactures uncertainty. And uncertainty sustained over months and years is more psychologically destabilizing than any argument. You can recover from a fight. You know where you stand after a fight. Sustained ambiguity keeps you in a permanent state of vigilance, permanently trying to read the room, permanently off balance. That's why they don't raise their voice. Not because they're calm. Because calm is more effective, and that, finally, is the name I promised you at the start. Researchers in coercive control call this ambient coercive control. The deliberate, patient, deniable erosion of someone's sense of reality through a sustained atmosphere rather than individual incidents. Now that you can see it, let's talk about what you actually do with that. Recognition is the first step, but recognition alone doesn't undo what years of absorbed doubt have built. So here's what actually helps. First, externalize the question. When you notice yourself spiraling into doubt, when you start asking, "Am I wrong about this?" Shift the frame. Ask instead, "What would I tell a close friend if they described this exact situation to me?" Your instincts work better when they're not aimed at yourself. You can see clearly for other people in a way that gets clouded when you're trying to assess your own experience. Use that. Second, document, not to build a legal case. Because it's significantly harder to rewrite a conversation you wrote down 5 minutes after it happened. A note in your phone, the date, what was said, how you felt immediately afterward. It doesn't need to be elaborate. You'd be surprised how quickly the pattern becomes undeniable when you can read it back in your own words from the same day it happened. Third, pay attention to how you feel after interactions, not during, not what was technically said, not whether it officially counted as a fight. Just, do you feel smaller, more confused, less certain of things you were confident about that morning? Your nervous system processes information that your conscious mind is still working to catch up with. That data is real. That data is yours. You were taught, systematically, patiently, deliberately, to question yourself, to doubt your memory before anyone else could doubt it for you. But here's what that process couldn't actually reach: the part of you that's still here, still trying to understand what happened. That instinct didn't go away. It's intact. The real question isn't whether this happened to you. The real question is what you do now that you finally have a name for what it was.